The Golden Empire high in the heart of the Andes, where the air thins and the sun blazes with sacred fire, once stood a civilization that defied the impossible. The Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. From the snowbound peaks of Colombia to the silver deserts of Chile, they ruled over 10 million souls with roads that outstretched the veins of an entire continent. Gold flowed like sunlight from their temples. Stones fit so perfectly that not even a blade of grass could slide between them. To the outside world, they appeared as gods walking the earth. But behind that perfection lies a question that history has never answered. How did they do it so suddenly? When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1532, they found an empire at its zenith, a world of monumental architecture, celestial observatories, and a command of agriculture that bent the mountain itself into obedience. Terraces spiraled up cliffsides like green cathedrals. Water ran through channels carved with mathematical precision, and the capital, Cusco, glimmered like a golden cross set at the navel of the world. To the chroniclers of Spain, this was a revelation, a civilization so advanced it seemed to have emerged from myth. Yet when they asked the Inca priests, the builders, the wise men of the Andes, one answer kept returning. We did not build everything you see. Some of it was here before us. Those words, recorded and often ignored, are the first crack in the myth of Inca origins. Because scattered across the Andes, beneath the polished walls of Cusco, beneath Machu Picchu's terraces, beneath the sacred lakes, lie ruins that defy Inca explanation. Stones older, heavier, and cut with a mastery that surpasses even their own. To the Inca, these ancient remains were huacas, sacred places of power left by beings who came long before them. They believed these sites were the work of the Viracochas, the tall, pale teachers of stone and light who emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca after a great darkness covered the world. And yet, in our textbooks, the Inca stand as the pinnacle and the beginning, as if nothing had come before, as if the Andes had been silent for thousands of years, until suddenly an empire arose fully formed. But history, like the mountains themselves, keeps its secrets layered deep. And in those layers, archaeologists and mythologists alike have begun to hear an older heartbeat, one that thrums beneath the gold, beneath the conquest, beneath the empire. Consider this: the Inca had no written language, no alphabet, no scrolls, no tablets, only the enigmatic quipus, cords of knotted thread that recorded their world in ways we still barely comprehend. Could a civilization capable of building such perfection have arisen without centuries, perhaps millennia, of cultural foundation behind it? Or were they the inheritors of something older, something that vanished in a storm of time? Because everywhere the Spanish went, they found the same story repeated, not just in Cusco, but in the farthest valleys and coastal deserts. The story of those who came before, a race of builders who raised walls the Inca could not replicate. A civilization that measured the heavens, mapped the solstices, and knew the language of the stones. And when that civilization disappeared, the Inca stepped into their ruins, repurposing, venerating, reinterpreting, as if awakening a giant that had only been sleeping. It's a narrative that mainstream archaeology often avoids, preferring the comfort of linear progress. Hunter-gatherers become farmers, farmers become builders, builders become empires. But what if that line is wrong? What if civilization is not a ladder, but a circle, one that rises, collapses, and rises again? Because deep in the Andes, beneath the veneer of time, the stones whisper of an age when gods walked as men and men reached for the stars. Then everything changed. For when we look beyond the myths and the chronicles, when we follow the trail of impossibly ancient ruins and forgotten stories, one truth begins to surface, one that could rewrite everything we think we know about the Incas and the world that came before them. the question no one asked. Every civilization has its beginning, at least that's what we're told. A seed, a spark, a slow evolution from chaos into order. But when it comes to the Inca, the story doesn't quite fit. There is no visible seed, no gradual rise through centuries of architecture or empire building. It is as if one day, out of the fog of the highlands, an empire appeared fully formed, with a system of roads, astronomy, agriculture, and governance, as if it had always been there. This is the question no one dared to ask. Where did the Incas really come from? The Spanish chronicles, those first confused accounts written between 1530 and 1570, are our main historical source. Yet even within them, contradictions swirl like the mountain mist. Some describe the Incas as divine children of the sun, Inti, emerging from the island of the sun on Lake Titicaca. Others claim they rose from the caves of Paccaritambo, guided by a figure of light named Manco Capac. But beneath every version, the subtext remains the same. They came from somewhere else. And when the chroniclers pressed them for details, for names, for dates, for proof, the Inca nobles smiled and said, "Those who built before us have vanished, vanished." A word that echoes through ancient myth like thunder over the Andes. Because in the Inca worldview, time was not linear. It was cyclical. The world had been created and destroyed multiple times. Each age ended with a cataclysm, flood, fire, darkness. The Incas believed they were merely the latest caretakers of a world rebuilt on ruins. So why then do modern historians still insist they were the first? Because when the Spanish arrived, they destroyed nearly every record that might have answered that question. Temples were stripped of gold, libraries of quipuas were burned, and the keepers of ancestral knowledge, the amautas, were executed or silenced. The empire fell, but with it fell something even more fragile, memory. And yet pieces of that memory survived, not in words, but in stone. Take, for instance, the walls of Sacsayhuaman, the colossal fortress that looms above Cusco. The Spanish called it the House of the Sun, but its true purpose remains unknown. Each stone weighs up to 300 tons, fitted together with surgical precision, as if the builders had liquefied the rock itself. The Incas claimed to have repaired it, not built it. They said it was older than the sun. The same pattern repeats from Machu Picchu to Ollantaytambo, from Pisac to the faraway ruins of Tiwanaku, lower layers of cyclopean, perfectly cut stone, topped by later cruder Inca masonry. It's as if the Incas were restoring someone else's world, one that had already turned to dust. But this idea that an advanced Andean civilization predates the Inca has long been dismissed as myth. Because if true, it challenges everything we know about the timeline of human development in South America. It suggests that civilization here may not have evolved upward, but rather recovered downward, a rebirth from the ashes of a forgotten golden age. And yet, evidence continues to whisper. Archaeologists have found ruins deep beneath Lake Titicaca, suggesting a city now drowned by rising waters. In the Sacred Valley, laser mapping has revealed ancient terraces buried under centuries of sediment, far older than the Inca roads that crossed them. And across Peru, legends persist, stories of teachers who came from the sea, bringing knowledge of the stars, agriculture, and stone. The chronicles call them Viracochas, but who or what were they really? The Incas described them as tall, fair-skinned, bearded beings, words that confounded the Spaniards, who believed they were seeing themselves reflected in legend. Yet those myths existed long before the first European sail touched the Pacific. If we strip away the colonial interpretation and return to the root of the story, what remains is astonishing, a memory of a civilization older than time, one that shaped the Andean world before history began. So the question deepens. If the Inca inherited their temples, their gods, and even their sacred geography from an earlier world, then who were those first architects of the Andes? And what catastrophe erased their name from history? Because somewhere between myth and memory, Between stone and silence lies the key to understanding not only the Incas, but humanity itself. And as we descend into the oldest layers of Andean history, one site stands as the first beacon of this forgotten age. A place so mysterious, so impossibly ancient that even today it defies all explanation. Beneath the stone, the mountains never forget. Even when empires fall, when tongues vanish and names are lost, the stones remain, silent, patient, unchanging. And if one learns to listen, they begin to speak. Beneath the Inca walls, beneath the temples of Cusco and the terraces of Machu Picchu, there is another world, older, rougher, and impossibly precise. A world built from stones so massive and so perfectly aligned that they seem to defy the very limits of human craftsmanship. Archaeologists call these megalithic foundations. But to the Andean elders, they are the bones of the earth, the remains of a civilization swallowed by time. When the Spanish conquistadors first reached Cusco, they marveled at the city's architecture. They described walls where no mortar was used, where each block fit into the next, with a precision that mocked their best European fortresses. But as the stones climbed higher, something changed. The masonry became rougher, less perfect, more typically Incan. The further down one looked, the more ancient and more impossible the stones appeared. This vertical paradox would become one of the great enigmas of the Andes. Why did the lower stones, the older ones, display greater technology? Shouldn't it be the opposite? In the Temple of the Sun, the Coricancha, the base is made of cyclopean blocks, each one carved with mathematical symmetry. Above it, Inca repairs look almost crude in comparison. This pattern repeats across the sacred valley, from the fortress of Ollantaytambo to the enigmatic stairways of Machu Picchu, suggesting that the Inca were, in truth, curators of ruins. They did not build upon empty land. They built upon memory. Modern archaeology dates the Inca Empire to roughly 1200–1532 CE, barely 3 centuries of history. Yet some of the foundational stones have been radiocarbon tested using lichen and sediment analysis, yielding results that suggest they could be thousands of years older. In the Andes, where earthquakes are constant, such constructions shouldn't even exist, and yet they stand as if defying geological time itself. The Inca never claimed to have created this architecture. They said it was already ancient when their ancestors arrived. They called it the work of the Viracochas, the Shining Ones, who emerged after the last age of darkness. And according to legend, these beings taught the survivors how to read the stars, how to speak to the mountains, and how to carve living stone as if it were clay. To the chronicler Juan de Betanzos, writing in 1551, these stories were confusing, mythological perhaps. But he noted something that later historians ignored. The Inca priests believed the world had been rebuilt many times, and that the first civilization, the one before the flood, had left behind their knowledge encoded in stone. If true, it would mean that what we call Inca civilization is not the beginning, but the echo of an older world, a reconstruction of wisdom that survived catastrophe. It would also explain why the Incas' understanding of astronomy, agriculture, and hydrology seems far too advanced for a society of their apparent age. At Ollantaytambo, massive andesite blocks lie scattered across the mountainside, half-carved, as if abandoned mid-construction by hands too powerful for their own time. One block, known as the Wall of the Six Monoliths, is aligned perfectly with the rising sun during the solstice, suggesting a design guided not merely by engineering, but by cosmic alignment. Whoever built it wasn't just shaping rock. They were mapping the heavens onto the earth. Some researchers have even proposed that these ancient builders possessed a forgotten technology, perhaps vibrational or sonic in nature, capable of softening stone at the molecular level. It sounds impossible until you realize that no tool marks exist on many of these stones, and that their surfaces appear almost molded rather than carved. Is it madness to imagine such a technology existing thousands of years ago? Or is it arrogance to believe we were the first to master it? Because as you move deeper into the mountains, the signs multiply. At Sacsayhuaman, Blocks weighing hundreds of tons curve like liquid around each other, locking together in seismic-resistant patterns that modern engineers still cannot reproduce. At Machu Picchu, hidden chambers beneath the main citadel remain sealed, inaccessible even to today's archaeologists, as if guarding something not meant to be found. And yet, the deeper we dig, the more we realize. The story of the Andes does not rise upward, it descends. Each layer takes us further back, closer to the dawn that history forgot. The Inca called their empire Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. But perhaps that name wasn't just geographical. Perhaps it was a memory, a reference to the four corners of a world that had once been whole, shattered, and rebuilt by survivors. Because beneath every temple, beneath every road, beneath the living stone, lies another civilization, silent, erased, but not entirely gone. And if we follow that trail far enough, it leads to one of the most mysterious sites on Earth, a place where myth and archaeology collide. Echoes before the empire. Before there were Incas, before the golden age of Cusco, before the chronicles of Spain, there were stories whispered in the wind, stories of a world destroyed and of luminous beings who came to rebuild it. The Incas called them Viracochas, the foam of the sea, the shining ones, those who walked out of the water when the darkness lifted. To the Quechua people, they were not gods in the divine sense, but architects of renewal. Teachers who emerged from Lake Titicaca after a great flood had drowned the earth. Their task was to bring light, order, and knowledge back to humanity. Every ancient culture remembers such a time. In Sumer, it was the age of the Anunnaki. In Egypt, the time of Zep-Tepi, the first time. In Mesoamerica, the return of Quetzalcoatl. And in the high Andes, it was the dawn of the Viracochas. The chronicler Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, writing in 1572, recorded that the Andean priests spoke of ages, not centuries. Each age ended in catastrophe. Fire from the sky, water from the deep, mountains trembling like beasts. The last one, they said, ended when the gods turned the world to darkness. Then, from the mist, a tall, bearded man clothed in white walked across the mountains, teaching the survivors how to live again. His name was Viracocha Pachayachachik, the instructor of the world. He was said to carry a staff that glowed with light, to heal the sick, and to raise walls by command alone. When his work was done, he walked westward across the ocean, promising to return when the world needed rebuilding once more. To Western ears, these tales sounded like superstition, but to the descendants of the Andes, they were not metaphors. They were memory, a memory of beings who carried knowledge of the stars, agriculture, and sacred geometry, a memory of those who built in stone what no empire since has equaled. Even the Inca rulers, the Sapa Incas, traced their bloodline to these beings. They called themselves children of the sun, not because they worshipped the sun as a deity, but because they believed their ancestors had descended from a celestial order that restored light after chaos. If that belief was mere legend, it is a remarkably consistent one. Across thousands of miles and dozens of tribes, Aymara, Quechua, Kola, and even the coastal Paracas, the same image persists. Tall beings with elongated skulls, radiant garments, and the power to move stone as if it were weightless. The Spanish, upon hearing this, assumed the natives were describing their own arrival, but these tales were ancient, long before 1532. They spoke of a cycle, an age when gods and men walked together. And within those myths lies something more tangible, coordinates, because the stories always point to the same place, Lake Titicaca, the birthplace of the sun, a lake that sits nearly 2,500 feet above sea level, impossibly high for such vast waters, and surrounded by ruins that predate recorded history. The Inca said their first ancestors emerged from the island in the lake's center, guided by the light of Viracocha. But beneath those calm waters, Sonar mapping has revealed the remnants of submerged temples, stone terraces, and roads, suggesting that the myth of the flood might not be metaphor at all, but memory. Imagine it, an ancient civilization thriving along the shores of a lake that later rose to engulf it, its temples preserved beneath centuries of sediment and myth. To the Inca, those ruins were sacred. To modern science, they are an anomaly waiting to be explained. Because the deeper divers go, the more they find. Not chaos, but structure, geometric alignments, carved blocks, and pathways leading nowhere but down. So, what happened to this civilization? Did a cataclysm erase it? A flood? A tilt of the earth? Or something far greater? And if so, could the Incas have inherited the fragments of a knowledge far older than their own history? As the Spanish tore through the Andes in search of gold, they never realized that what they were destroying was not just a people, it was a timeline, one that stretched far beyond the empire they conquered, one that hinted at an age when the Andes themselves were the cradle of human knowledge. For if the myths are to be believed, the Incas were not founders, they were rememberers, caretakers of a world that had risen and fallen long before their own, a world whose voice still echoes through the stones, through the mountains, through the very name Andes, derived, some say, from the ancient root anta, meaning copper, shining, eternal. And the next chapter in that forgotten story lies where the legend of Viracocha began, on the windswept plains near Lake Titicaca. There, at the ruins of Tiwanaku, we find the fingerprints of the gods, and the proof that the Andes were not born with the Incas, but reborn from something far older. The enigma of Tiwanaku. At nearly 13,000 feet above sea level, where the air thins and the horizon burns silver against the clouds, lies a place that should not exist. A city carved from the bones of the earth, vast, geometrically precise, and older than history itself. Its name is Tiwanaku. To most textbooks, Tiwanaku is the cradle of Andean civilization, a pre-Incan city that flourished between 400 and 1000 CE. But to those who have walked its silent plazas, touched the stone of its temples, and traced its impossible alignments, it feels far older, as if it were the echo of an age long before humanity was supposed to build in stone. Archaeologists have struggled for over a century to understand it. Its monoliths rise from the altiplano like the remains of a forgotten titan. Stones weighing hundreds of tons are cut with laser-like precision, interlocked without mortar, their surfaces etched with symbols that no known culture of the Andes can fully decipher. And yet, the site sits in the middle of an empty plain, far from any known quarry, far from any river that could have carried such weight. The ancient Aymara people called Tiwanaku Taipicala, the stone at the center of the world. To them, this was not merely a city, it was the axis of creation itself. And according to their oldest legends, this is where Viracocha rose from the waters of Lake Titicaca to remake the world after the Great Flood. The Spanish chroniclers, writing in the 16th century, were awed by what they saw. Pedro Tieza de Leon described it as a city built by giants, for no human hands could have set these stones. Others claimed the walls were older than the flood of Noah itself. Even the Inca rulers, when asked who built Tiwanaku, replied, "It was here before the sun rose for the first time." What they meant was clear. Tiwanaku belonged to a forgotten world. Modern excavation has revealed only a fraction of the site. Beneath the visible ruins lies an immense complex still buried under centuries of soil, temples, plazas, and what appears to be a system of underground channels aligned to celestial events. Satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar have shown that Tiwanaku's layout is astronomically precise. The Kalasasaya Temple, for instance, is aligned perfectly to the solstices and equinoxes, functioning as an ancient solar calendar. How could a culture that supposedly lacked the wheel, the arch, and the written word construct such a cosmic machine? The centerpiece of Tiwanaku's mystery is the Gateway of the Sun, a single 10-ton monolith carved from andesite, etched with the image of a winged figure surrounded by 48 smaller icons. Scholars call it a calendar. The locals call it something else, the door between worlds. The figure at its center, known as the Weeping God or Lord of the Staffs, bears uncanny resemblance to Viracocha, the same bearded teacher who, according to legend, reawakened humanity after the cataclysm. Some researchers see in it the blueprint of time itself, a code that marks the end and rebirth of world ages, what the Incas called Pachacuti, the turning of the world. In 2001, a team of Bolivian archaeologists uncovered evidence that Tiwanaku may have been aligned not to the sky of today, but to a sky as it appeared over 12,000 years ago. If true, that would place its construction around the end of the last ice age, a time when the Andes were very different, and when most of South America was still emerging from the glaciers. Mainstream academia rejected the claim. The date was too old, but the stones remained unmoved. And perhaps that's the greatest enigma of all. The stones do not care about our timelines. They remember only the hands that shaped them. And those hands, whoever they belonged to, understood something we no longer do. Because Tiwanaku is not just architecture. It's geometry turned into theology. Every measurement, every angle, every shadow cast by the sun on the solstice speaks of an order that blends science and spirit into one. It is as if the builders were encoding a cosmic truth, that the heavens and the earth are one body, bound by rhythm and proportion. Whoever built this place, they were not primitive. They were mathematicians, astronomers, engineers, and perhaps something more. Something ancient memory calls the first people, those who survived the flood and rebuilt civilization where the world touched the sky. The Andean shamans still speak of them in ceremony. They say Tiwanaku is alive, that its stones hum at night when the stars align, resonating with a frequency that connects heaven and earth. A memory made of vibration, not words. A message carved in silence. And if Tiwanaku is truly that message, then it was never meant for the Incas alone. It was meant for us, for anyone willing to remember what the world was before history began. But the question remains, if Tiwanaku was the cradle, then what came before the cradle? What knowledge, or what catastrophe, birthed this impossible city in the first place? Because 40 miles away, on the southern shore of the same lake, lies another site, smaller, but even more baffling. A place where the stones are not merely carved, but seemingly molded, fused, and interlocked with a precision that challenges everything we know about the ancient world. Lake Titicaca, cradle of gods. At dawn, the air above Lake Titicaca turns to silver. The water lies so still that it mirrors the heavens, sky and earth merging in a single breath. For the Andean people, this is not just a lake. It is the birthplace of the world, the place where the sun first rose after darkness, and where the gods walked upon the waters to awaken humankind. They call it Titicaca, the rock of the Puma. To them, it is the navel of creation. According to ancient myth, after the great flood that drowned the earth, the god Viracocha rose from the depths of this lake, carrying light in both hands. He shaped the sun, moon, and stars, then molded new men and women from clay, teaching them how to live, plant, and build. When his work was done, he traveled across the Andes, leaving behind knowledge encoded in sacred places, the Huacas, before vanishing into the sea to the west. To the Spanish chroniclers, these were pagan fables. But as modern science probes deeper into the lake's depths, the myths begin to take on an unexpected form, one made of stone. In 2000, a team of Bolivian and Italian researchers announced the discovery of submerged ruins beneath Lake Titicaca. Using sonar mapping and underwater photography, they found terraces, walls, and even a temple complex stretching nearly half a mile long, hidden 100 feet below the surface. Carbon dating of artifacts retrieved from the site suggested an age of at least 3,500 years, possibly much older. The indigenous Aymara guides who accompanied the expedition were not surprised. They said simply, "The gods told us this was there. How could such a vast structure lie beneath the lake?" Geological studies indicate that the water level of Titicaca has fluctuated drastically over millennia. During the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, the region experienced violent tectonic shifts. Entire valleys could have been swallowed by rising waters, turning cities into tombs beneath the waves. Could it be that the myths of the flood, told across continents, from Sumer to the Andes, are not symbolic, but historical? Divers who have explored the site describe a haunting silence. Massive cut stones, stairways leading nowhere, and what appear to be monolithic altars, now colonized by algae and ancient time. Some say the formations are natural, others insist their geometric precision and orientation to the solstice sun are too deliberate to be coincidence. But even skeptics admit there is something profoundly organized beneath those waters. The Incas, centuries later, treated the lake as the holiest place on earth. They built the Temple of the Sun on the island of the Sun and the Temple of the Moon on the island of the Moon, directly above where the oldest ruins now lie submerged. From there, priests would perform rituals to speak with the waters, believing the lake was a doorway between worlds, between the world of men and the world of gods. And perhaps, in a way, they were right, because Lake Titicaca is more than a geographical mystery. It's a geological anomaly. It is the highest navigable lake in the world, but also one of the oldest. Scientists believe it was formed millions of years before the Andes themselves rose around it, which means, in a literal sense, the lake is older than the mountains that cradle it. Its waters, therefore, are a record of deep time, layers of silt and memory preserved like pages of an untranslatable book. And buried within those pages may be the story of the first civilization to ever rise in the Americas, a civilization that vanished when the world changed, leaving only echoes for the Inca to inherit. The Aymara say that when the stars fall into the lake, the spirits of the builders awaken. Fishermen claim to hear whispers in the night, low hums that travel through the water like the pulse of the earth itself. Some call it superstition, others call it resonance, the vibration of stone structures beneath the waves. Perhaps both are true, because every myth begins as a memory, and every memory, in time, becomes a myth. Lake Titicaca is not just the cradle of the gods, it is the womb of the forgotten world. Its surface reflects the sky, but its depths reflect the past. And in those depths, the story of the Andes does not end, it begins. But the mystery of the lake leads inevitably to something even greater, a site just beyond its southern shore, where the builders of Tiwanaku left behind their most audacious work, a place that redefines everything we think we know about ancient engineering, a site that seems to mock time itself. The giants of Puma Punku, on the windswept plains west of Lake Titicaca, where the cold bites like iron and thunder rolls across the Altiplano, lies a place that feels less like a ruin and more like the aftermath of a cataclysm. Massive blocks of red sandstone and gray andesite lie scattered across the ground as if hurled by an unseen hand. Some weigh more than 100 tons, each one carved with a precision that defies reason. This is Puma Punku, the door of the Puma, and it is, without question, one of the most enigmatic sites on Earth. Archaeologists classify it as part of the Tiwanaku complex, but to anyone who has stood among its shattered blocks, it feels like something entirely different, something older, more deliberate, more advanced. Here, stone is treated not as matter, but as thought made solid. The first Spanish explorers who visited the site were speechless. In 1549, Pedro Chiesa de Leon wrote, "I cannot imagine what kind of tools could have been used to make these stones so perfect, nor how they could have been moved to this place." Centuries later, that mystery remains, because Puma Punku is not built, it is engineered. Every block bears right angles so exact that even a razor blade cannot slip between them. Some stones are cut into intricate H shapes, identical down to the millimeter, as if they were mass-produced by machines. Others feature precision-drilled holes, slots, and interlocking joints, as though designed for assembly, not construction. And yet, according to conventional history, this was achieved more than 500 years ago by a culture with no metal tools, no wheel, and no written plans. How? Modern engineers who have examined the stones admit that even with today's technology, diamond-tipped saws and computer-guided cutters, replicating these patterns on such hard rock would be a challenge. The gray andesite of Puma Punku is one of the hardest materials on Earth, comparable to granite, yet it was shaped, fitted, and polished with the precision of a spacecraft component. No tool marks, no chisels, no errors, only perfection. Some researchers propose that the stones were shaped using lost techniques, perhaps involving intense heat, vibration, or even acoustic resonance. Ancient legends describe the builders as possessing a sound of power, a tone that could lift and soften stone. When Andean elders were asked how their ancestors moved the monoliths, they answered with the same phrase every time. They sang to the stones. To modern ears, it sounds poetic, but to a civilization that saw sound as sacred geometry, perhaps it was literal. Sound, after all, is vibration, and vibration is energy. Could the builders of Puma Punku have known how to harness it? The site's name itself hints at something more. Puma Punku, the door of the puma, is thought to refer to a celestial alignment. In ancient Andean cosmology, the puma symbolized power and transformation, the guardian of thresholds between worlds, and this entire complex appears to have been built as one vast threshold. The layout mirrors the constellation of the Southern Cross at its zenith. The angles of the remaining walls align with the solstices and equinoxes. And beneath the ground, magnetometric scans have revealed buried chambers, resonant cavities, perhaps once filled with water or sound. When seen from above, Puma Punku is not chaos but pattern, fragments of a shattered code. Was it a temple, a power station, a stargate, or was it all of these things, unified by a science so ancient that we now call it myth? Even the Inca, when they first encountered the ruins, were afraid to touch them. They called Puma Punku the place where the gods began the world. To them, it was sacred beyond comprehension, a remnant of the first age, when divine beings taught humanity the language of creation itself. Modern archaeology dates the site to around 500 CE, linking it to Tiwanaku, but radiocarbon tests of organic material beneath the foundation stones have yielded ages as old as 15,000 years, long before the first known city in the Americas. Such dates are controversial, dismissed by many as contamination or error. Yet even if the stones were later rearranged, their origin remains a riddle. Who carved them? With what? And why? Because what lies broken today once stood whole, an architectural symphony of interlocking forms, precise as if designed on a cosmic grid. Some blocks bear grooves that align perfectly with others miles away, suggesting the site may have been part of a far larger complex, perhaps even connected to the submerged ruins of Lake Titicaca. And that brings us back to the flood. The deluge that myths say swept across the Andes, erasing an entire civilization. To the descendants of those mountains, Puma Punku is what remains of that lost world. The bones of a civilization drowned by time, waiting for the next turning of the world. The next Pachacuti stand among its ruins at dusk, and the wind moves through the stones like a breath, deep, hollow, resonant. It is the sound of memory itself, a voice from before the empire, before history, before even the first sunrise over the Andes. But what ended that age? What force could shatter a civilization so advanced, leaving only broken geometry and silence? The answer may lie not in conquest or decay, but in something far greater, something written in the language of the earth itself. When time was reset, there are moments in Earth's history when time itself seems to stop, when nature, in one violent heartbeat, erases everything that came before. Volcanoes roar, oceans rise, mountains fall, and humanity, whatever form it takes, begins again. For the peoples of the Andes, this moment was known as Pachacuti, the turning of the world. It was not the end, but the great reset, the destruction that makes rebirth possible. And somewhere between the last age and our own, the Andes remember such a turning. Every culture on Earth carries its version of the story. In Sumer, the gods sent a flood to cleanse the world. In Egypt, the sky goddess Nut wept until the Nile drowned the land. In Mesoamerica, the world was burned and drowned 5 times over. And in the Andes, the mountains themselves shattered, and the gods walked away. The Aymara say that long ago, the earth was soft, the stars were closer, and the builders of the first city, those who carved Tiwanaku and Puma Punku, lived in harmony with the sky. But one day the balance broke, the heavens shifted, the seas rose, and the sun, the very heart of the world, disappeared for days. When it returned, nothing was the same. To scientists, this myth sounds eerily familiar, because around 12,800 years ago, Earth did experience a sudden catastrophe. The Younger Dryas event, a mysterious global cooling that struck at the end of the last ice age, wiped out countless species and altered the planet's climate overnight. In the geological record, it appears as a thin layer of black sediment, soot, nanodiamonds, and molten glass found on every continent. Something burned the world. Some researchers believe it was caused by a massive comet impact, fragments striking the northern hemisphere and triggering global fires, floods, and earthquakes. Others point to solar flares or volcanic supereruptions. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Civilizations, if they existed, were erased. Sea levels rose over 400 feet, and entire regions of the planet, including the high plains of South America, were transformed forever. Could it be that the flood of Viracocha, the Andean memory of the sun disappearing, is a human echo of that very cataclysm? At Lake Titicaca, sediment cores show sudden evidence of massive flooding around the same time, roughly 11,500 BCE. In the Peruvian desert, geologists have found marine fossils far above the current sea level, suggesting tectonic upheaval so violent that land became ocean and ocean became land. And deep beneath Tiwanaku, radar scans reveal buried layers of stone that predate known human civilization by millennia. Imagine what it must have looked like. A world of light turned to fire. Earthquakes tearing through the Andes as glaciers melted and rivers of mud swept across the Altiplano. Cities crumbling into dust. The builders of Puma Punku fleeing to the mountains, their knowledge carried in memory and myth. Perhaps that is why the Incas spoke of multiple creations, because they were not merely telling stories, but preserving the trauma of a world that had died and been reborn. And perhaps that is why the stones of Tiwanaku stand half-buried, half-broken, not unfinished, but survivors of a forgotten dawn. Their precision may not have been destroyed by time, but by catastrophe. A reset so complete that even history itself was rewritten. When the world finally calmed, when the sun rose again over the Andes, humanity, or what remained of it, began to rebuild. But what do survivors do when they inherit ruins? They build again, not from scratch, but from memory. They carry fragments of a lost age, stories, symbols, technologies they no longer fully understand. And in time, those fragments become the foundation of new empires, new religions, new myths. Could the Inca have been the distant heirs of those survivors? Could the Empire of the Sun have been born from the ashes of the builders of the stars? It would explain much. Their sudden mastery of engineering, their reverence for stone, their obsession with cosmic alignment, their conviction that history moves in cycles. To the Inca, time was not a line, but a spiral, an endless dance of creation, destruction, and return. And perhaps they knew that every spiral begins at a point, the moment when the world resets. What we call prehistory may not be the beginning of civilization, but the end of a civilization before ours. And the ruins scattered across the Andes are not evidence of primitive beginnings. They are tombstones of forgotten sophistication. Stand on the plateau of Tiwanaku as night falls, and you can almost feel it. the hum beneath your feet, the stillness before dawn. The air is thin, the stars painfully bright, and for an instant, time feels fragile, as if it could fracture again. Because in the story of the Andes, the end is never final. The world turns, the gods depart, the mountains rise, and humanity forgets, only to remember once more. And as we move beyond the cataclysm, we begin to see the faint outlines of what followed, the first sparks of a rebirth, the civilizations that rose upon the bones of the old world. Caral, the mother city. When the world began again, the mountains were quiet. The winds that once screamed across the Andes grew still, and the sea crept slowly back to its shore. The old gods had vanished, but their memory lingered, whispered through stone and starlight, and somewhere, on the dry coast of Peru, humanity awoke once more. There, between the desert and the Pacific, lies Caral, a city older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than the first stones of Sumer. It stands in the Soup Valley, surrounded by silence and sand, like the fossil of an idea, civilization itself. Archaeologists call it the sacred city of Caral Supa, the first urban center of the Americas. But to those who have walked its circular plazas at dusk, it feels like something deeper, a memory of rebirth, the echo of a people rebuilding the world after time was reset. For nearly 5,000 years, Caral lay hidden beneath the desert wind. It was rediscovered only in the late 1990s, when Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis uncovered the remains of monumental platforms, staircases, and plazas, arranged with extraordinary precision. The dating shocked the world. Around 2600 BCE, nearly 1,500 years before the Inca civilization even existed. And yet Caral emerged not from chaos, but from order. Its architecture, art, and social structure appeared suddenly, as if inherited. 6 large pyramidal mounds, a network of circular amphitheaters, sophisticated irrigation channels, and an understanding of acoustics that would shame modern architects. The city was a symphony of geometry, a place where mathematics met the sacred. Even more extraordinary was what Caral lacked. No signs of war, no fortifications, no weapons. This was not a city built on conquest, but on harmony. Its people, the Caral Supe culture, were priests, astronomers, engineers, and musicians. They worshipped the cycles of the stars, built their temples to mirror celestial events, and played flutes made from the bones of condors, instruments that still sing when the wind passes through them. Who were these people? How did such a sophisticated society appear in what textbooks call the Neolithic world? And where did they learn to build in stone so suddenly, to organize, to measure, to align? Some scholars suggest they were the cultural heirs of a much older tradition, survivors of a forgotten lineage that stretched back to the high Andes and beyond. Their knowledge, though adapted to the coastal plains, carries traces of that earlier world. The same obsession with the sky, the same solar alignments, the same geometric perfection found in Tiwanaku and Puma Punku. Perhaps Caral was not the beginning, but the rebuilding, the rebirth of a memory carried through myth and blood. The city's layout reveals something profound. Its main pyramids are aligned with the sun's movement along the horizon, while its circular plaza amplifies sound so perfectly that a whisper can be heard clear across it. In this way, Caral was not just a settlement, it was an instrument, tuned to the cosmos itself. Every ceremony, every vibration of the drum or flute resonated through the sand and stone like a dialogue with the universe. Even their construction techniques seem eerily advanced. Instead of stone walls alone, the builders filled woven reed bags with rock and sand, creating earthquake-resistant structures millennia before modern engineering rediscovered the same principle. They were not guessing, they were remembering. And like all great beginnings, Caral leaves behind more questions than answers. Why did they vanish? There is no evidence of invasion, no fire, no destruction. It's as if they simply walked away, leaving their city intact, a monument, to the dawn. Did drought drive them inland? Did shifting trade routes scatter them? Or did they migrate deliberately, following some ancient map that led them back toward the highlands, toward the sacred mountains of their ancestors? Because even after Caral's disappearance, echoes of its architecture appear in later Andean cultures: Chavin, Nazca, Paracas, and eventually the Inca themselves. It is as if Caral passed the torch forward, ensuring that the memory of harmony, order, and celestial design would never die. Standing among the sand-covered pyramids today, the air still hums with something timeless. At sunset, the horizon glows the color of gold dust, and shadows fall across the amphitheater like the markings of a cosmic clock. And one cannot help but feel that this was not humanity's first attempt, but its return. Caral teaches us that civilization does not always rise from savagery. Sometimes it rises from remembrance, from the ashes of an age that refused to vanish completely. And if this was the first rebirth of the Andes, then it was not the last. Because as Caral faded into legend, another people began to emerge further south, in the deserts of Nazca, where the land itself would become their message to the gods. Nazca, messages to the sky. South of Caral, beyond the fertile valleys and into the bone-dry expanse of the Peruvian desert, the land begins to whisper again. No temples, no towering pyramids, only endless plains of dust and silence. But seen from above, the desert comes alive. Lines stretch for miles, intersecting, spiraling, weaving figures of animals, gods, and geometric perfection across a landscape that seems designed for the eyes of heaven itself. This is Nazca, the desert that speaks to the sky. When pilots first flew over the region in the 1920s, they could not believe what they saw. Etched into the desert floor, massive drawings: monkeys, hummingbirds, spiders, serpents, spirals, and straight lines running as far as the horizon. Some span over 300 feet across, perfectly proportioned, carved by removing a thin layer of oxidized rock to reveal the pale earth beneath. Visible only from the air, they have survived for nearly 2 millennia, untouched by rain, preserved by the eternal stillness of the Peruvian plateau. Who made them, and why? Mainstream archaeology attributes the lines to the Nazca culture, which flourished between 200 BCE and 700 CE. They were descendants of earlier coastal peoples, inheritors of Caral's spiritual geometry. But the scale of their art and its precision challenges explanation. How could a society with no aircraft, no aerial perspective, and only simple tools design patterns visible only from miles above? The Nazca people themselves claimed they were offerings, messages to the gods of the sky. Each line, each figure, was a prayer inscribed upon the earth. But perhaps there was more to it. Perhaps these were not messages merely to the gods, but for the gods, markers for something to return. The desert around Nazca is not random. Many lines point directly to the horizon where the sun, moon, and certain stars rise and set during solstices and equinoxes. In other words, the entire plateau is an astronomical calendar, a cosmic diagram of time and movement. From the ground, the lines seem meaningless. From the sky, they are revelation. Could it be that the Nazca were preserving a form of knowledge that began thousands of years earlier? The same geometry of alignment found at Tiwanaku, at Caral, and even in the myths of Viracocha? If so, then the desert is not art. It is language, the oldest language of all, geometry. At the heart of Nazca lies something even stranger. Long, ruler straight lines run perfectly parallel for miles, as if drawn by machine. Some intersect in complex grids, others fan outward from a single point, resembling modern runways. To the eyes of early 20th century explorers, they looked like landing strips, a comparison that fueled countless theories of ancient flight. But whatever their true purpose, one thing is certain: they were meant to be seen from above. In the mythic memory of the Andes, the gods came from the sky and departed into it. They taught humanity to build, to plant, to measure the heavens. When they left, they promised to return. Is it possible that the Nazca lines were built to guide them back? Vast beacons carved into the desert so the shining ones would find their way home? Some might call that fantasy. But to the Nazca, faith and science were not separate. Their world was one of correspondence. What was drawn on earth reflected what moved in heaven. Every spiral echoed a galaxy. Every animal mirrored a constellation. The earth was the mirror of the sky, and the sky was watching. Recent studies using satellite mapping have revealed over 1,000 previously unknown lines, some far older than the known Nazca figures, possibly predating the culture itself. Could these earlier markings be the remnants of a forgotten age, a continuation of the same cosmic dialogue begun in Caral or even Tiwanaku? Among them is one design unlike any other, a humanoid figure standing tall on a hillside, arms raised to the heavens. Locals call it El Astronauta, the astronaut. Its gaze, forever fixed upward, seems less like worship and more like memory. When the wind blows across the desert, the lines breathe. Their silence becomes a hum. And standing there, surrounded by figures too vast to comprehend, one feels the same awe the ancients must have felt. The sense that the universe was once intimate, that communication with the stars was not metaphor, but experience. Nazca is proof that the people of the Andes never forgot. Even after cataclysm, exile, and rebirth, they still remembered the gods of the sky and still sought to speak with them. But while Nazca reached upward, others looked inward, to the bloodlines of the Andes themselves. They searched for the origin not in the stars above, but in the people below, in the body and bone of their ancestors. And there, another mystery awaited, one written not in stone or sand, but in the very fabric of life. The genetic puzzle. Every civilization leaves behind its monuments, temples, roads, pyramids, gods. But there is another kind of monument, invisible and indestructible, the one written in our own cells, DNA, the library of life. And in that library, every human carries the echoes of every journey, every catastrophe, every rebirth. To understand who built the Andes, we must read that invisible scripture. For centuries, the origins of the Andean peoples were assumed to be simple. Textbooks told us they descended from nomadic tribes that crossed the Bering Strait around 12,000 years ago, migrating slowly south until they filled the Americas. But recent genetic discoveries have begun to challenge that elegant, linear tale. In 2018, an international team of geneticists sequenced the genomes of ancient Andean remains, mummies preserved by the dry cold of the highlands. The results were startling. Some DNA markers in these ancient individuals showed no direct connection to North American or Siberian lineages, but instead suggested isolation or contact far earlier than expected. Certain mitochondrial haplogroups, the genetic signatures passed through mothers, showed affinities with populations once thought to have lived only in the Pacific Islands. How could such a link exist? One possibility is migration by sea, a notion once dismissed as fantasy. But the more we study the Pacific currents, the less impossible it seems. The Humboldt Current, which flows from Polynesia toward the South American coast, would have made eastward voyages not only feasible, but inevitable. Archaeologists have found chicken bones with Polynesian genetic markers buried in Chile, dated to centuries before European contact. If chickens could cross the ocean, why not people? And if people did, then the Andes were not isolated. They were connected to a vast prehistoric world of travelers, sailors, and dreamers. That realization changes everything. The genetic story deepens. In 2021, studies of cranial morphology and DNA extracted from elongated skulls found in Paracas, those strange cone-shaped crania that puzzled generations of researchers, revealed another anomaly. While most were clearly the result of deliberate cranial binding, a few appeared structurally different. Larger cranial volume, fewer cranial sutures, and, in at least one specimen, a distinct mitochondrial sequence not matching any known native lineage. Was this a mutation, or the last biological whisper of an older, unrecorded ancestry, one that might explain the sudden leaps in culture and technology across the Andes? Such findings are controversial, of course. Mainstream science urges caution, reminding us that contamination and sample size can distort results. But even caution cannot erase the pattern. The Andean genome tells a story more complex than simple migration. It tells of layers, of peoples mixing, separating, surviving cataclysm, and perhaps preserving the bloodlines of a civilization that predated memory. And then there are the legends, the oral DNA. Among the Aymara and Quechua elders, there persists an ancient teaching. The first ones came from the sea, the second from the mountains, and the third were born from us. This triad eerily mirrors the genetic data. 3 distinct waves, 3 human templates shaping the Andes. Could the first have been survivors of a lost maritime culture, refugees from the flood that ended the last world age? Could the second have been mountain dwellers, those who rebuilt civilization in the high plains of Tiwanaku? And the third, the children of both, the Incas themselves. Modern geneticists are beginning to accept what myth has always known, that ancestry is not a straight line, but a web, a tapestry woven through migration, catastrophe, and renewal. And perhaps embedded in that tapestry is the truth of how knowledge itself survived the ages, not through books or machines, but through blood. For if the Andean genome carries traces of oceanic contact, then humanity's story may need rewriting. It would mean that civilization did not radiate outward from a single cradle, but was seeded, distributed across the world by a network of ancient mariners who shared one unbroken idea, that humanity was not alone on Earth. Even the Inca myths seem to hint at this. Their chronicles speak of Viracocha creating distinct races in different lands, giving each its own form and wisdom before vanishing into the sea. To them, difference was not division, it was memory. And as we decode our DNA, we are discovering that the ancient stories were right in one essential way. We are not the beginning, we are the continuation. But the puzzle is far from complete, because the genes tell us something else, something even more mysterious. Hidden in the bloodlines of the Andes are markers of adaptation so extreme that they seem almost engineered. Red blood cells twice as efficient, lungs that thrive where oxygen dies, and a metabolism tuned to thin air. Science calls it evolution, but to the elders, it is remembrance. The body remembering what it was built to endure after the last world fell. And that, perhaps, is the most extraordinary revelation of all. The builders of the Andes were not just architects of stone, they were architects of themselves, their bodies, their blood, their breath, all shaped by the memory of survival. As the Incas would later say, the sun does not rise on the first day, it rises again. And with this new light, the next mystery begins to glow. The question of movement, of connection, of the forgotten roots that may have carried knowledge across oceans and epochs. The oceanic connection. The Andes end not in mountains, but in silence, a long descent to the Pacific, where the land surrenders to the sea. And for millennia, that sea has held a secret. It is the same ocean that carried storms, myths, and perhaps memories. Modern maps show the Pacific as a vast emptiness, an endless blue separating continents. But to the ancients, it was alive. It breathed, it moved, it connected. Its currents were highways of salt and wind, carrying stories from one shore to another long before the age of sails. Could the Andes, that cradle of forgotten gods, have been linked to the wider world through these very waters? Archaeologists once said no. They taught that pre-Columbian civilizations were isolated, sealed off by the ocean. But the evidence is beginning to whisper otherwise. On the coast of Peru, pottery fragments have been found bearing designs strikingly similar to those of Polynesia, spirals, concentric circles, and depictions of solar deities. Even the weaving patterns of ancient Andean textiles, echo motifs, found thousands of miles away in the islands of Samoa and Easter Island, Rapa Nui. Coincidence, perhaps, but how many coincidences make a connection? In 1947, Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl set out to prove a heresy. He built a primitive balsa raft named Kon-Tiki and sailed from Peru into the Pacific using only ancient methods, the same winds, the same currents, the same faith. After 101 days, he reached Polynesia. It was proof such a voyage was not only possible, it was inevitable. Mainstream scholars dismissed Heyerdahl's broader conclusions, but the ocean did not. It still speaks the same language of tides and stars that ancient navigators once read with their bare eyes. And perhaps those sailors carried more than goods or people. Perhaps they carried ideas, the blueprints of civilization itself. Genetic studies now reveal faint traces of Andean ancestry among some Polynesian populations. And Polynesian ancestry in South American remains centuries before European contact. The same is true of crops. The sweet potato, native to the Andes, appears across the Pacific Islands long before Columbus was born. Its Quechua name, Kumar, survives almost unchanged in Polynesia as Kumara. Language itself has become a fossil of contact. Imagine it. Ancient sailors, not conquerors but messengers, setting out from the coast of Peru in reed boats guided by the stars. They follow the Humboldt Current northwest, letting the trade winds carry them across the endless blue. They bring with them seeds, songs, and stories of a lost age, and when they land on distant islands, they do what all survivors of cataclysm do. They rebuild. Could it be that the megalithic wonders scattered across the Pacific, Easter Islands Moai, the terraces of Micronesia, the stone cities of Nanmadol, are all echoes of the same ancestral memory that shaped Tiwanaku and Caral? Different faces, same idea, to turn the world into a mirror of the heavens. Even the myths align. In Rapa Nui, the creator god Make arrives from the sea, bringing light to a darkened world, a clear twin to the Andean Viracocha. In Polynesia, a hero sails east in search of the land of dawn, a sacred mountain rising from the sea. And in the Andes, the gods depart westward, promising to return. The two stories meet in the middle of the ocean. What if the Pacific was once not a divide but a memory of migration, the watery vein through which the old world flowed into the new? Oceanographers studying ancient sea levels note that during the last ice age, islands now submerged would have formed stepping stones across the Pacific. It's possible that entire archipelagos, now lost beneath the waves, once connected South America to Oceania. And if that is true, then the story of the Andes is not a local tale. It's part of a global chorus, the same one sung in Egypt, in Sumer, in the Indus Valley, a song of gods from the sea, of civilizations reborn from flood and fire. Perhaps the builders of the Andes were not only remembering their own past, perhaps they were remembering the world's. Perhaps the Pacific was once the artery of a forgotten network of knowledge, uniting continents before time was rewritten. Even today, the fishermen of northern Peru tell stories of Balseros del Sol, the sailors of the sun. They say these men crossed the ocean long before the Spaniards, guided by glowing stars that rose from the western horizon. And when asked where they came from, the elders answer softly, "From the islands that drowned when the world was young." Science may not yet prove such voyages, but the ocean keeps its secrets well. Its depths hide ruins, bones, and ships, but also the truth that every wave has a memory. So perhaps the Andes were never isolated at all. Perhaps they were the western frontier of a much older world, one that reached across the sea, connecting all the sacred geographies of Earth in one continuous chain of remembrance. And if that world once existed, its shadow still guides us, through myth, through stone, and now through blood. But as civilization spread again across the Andes, something began to awaken. A new people, born of the mountain and the sun, who would inherit not only the stones, but the silence of the gods. The Inca awakening. The mountains remember everything, and after millennia of silence, after floods, fire, and forgotten empires, they called once more. From those frozen heights, From the valleys carved by ancient hands, a new people began to rise. They called themselves Inca, children of the sun. Their empire would become the last echo of a world that refused to die. But the story of their rise is not one of sudden invention. It is a story of remembrance, a civilization awakening from a dream it had forgotten it was dreaming. According to Inca legend, when darkness covered the world and chaos ruled the valleys, the god Inti, the sun itself, sent two beings to restore order, Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, the first ancestors. They emerged from the sacred waters of Lake Titicaca, the same womb from which Viracocha had once risen in ages past. Carrying a golden staff, they wandered the land, searching for the place where it would sink into the earth. That place, they said, would be the center of the world, Cusco, the navel of the earth. What they found there was not emptiness, but memory. Ruins older than their language, terraces shaped by forgotten hands, stones that hummed with power. The Incas did not erase these relics. They worshipped them, re-inhabited them, rebuilt upon them. They called these ancient sites huacas, places where the energy of the gods still lived. Their empire was not conquest, it was resurrection. By the time the Spanish arrived, Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters, stretched across 2,500 miles, from Ecuador to Chile, from the jungles to the sea. Its roads, carved through mountains and deserts, rivaled those of Rome. Its bridges hung like threads of light over canyons 1,000 feet deep. Its cities glittered with gold, not for wealth, but as offerings to the sun. Yet even in their glory, the Incas always said, "We are not the first." In their temples, the priests spoke of cycles, worlds that had come before, each destroyed and reborn. They called this the Pachacuti, the great turning of time. And they believed they were living near the end of one such cycle, a moment when the world once again would shift. Their empire, then, was not arrogance. It was preparation. Everything the Incas built, from the shape of their cities to the rhythm of their ceremonies, was an act of remembering. Cusco, their capital, was laid out in the form of a puma, the symbol of power and guardianship. Its heart, the Coricancha, or Temple of the Sun, was covered in gold sheets that caught the morning light like fire. But beneath that temple, buried deep in its foundation, lay megalithic stones that predated the Inca by millennia. Even the sun itself, the Incas believed, had inherited its throne. The chroniclers who walked Cusco's streets after its fall wrote of a city built upon another city, of roads that followed ancient alignments, of walls that fit like puzzles, their joints curved as if the stone had once been molten. The Incas, they said, did not understand these older stones. They revered them. They called them Huacas de los Antiguos, the shrines of the ancients. To destroy them would have been to insult the gods. And yet, within that reverence lay a secret pride, the sense that the Incas were the chosen ones to continue what the ancients began. They saw themselves not as conquerors of the past, but as its fulfillment, the return of light after ages of shadow. For them, empire was not dominion over others. It was harmony, the restoration of balance between earth, sky, and man. Their very language, Quechua, carries that philosophy. Pachamama, Mother Earth. Inti, the Sun Father. Kalpa, sacred energy. In those words lived the memory of a cosmic order, one that echoed the knowledge of Tiwanaku and Caral, of the builders before time. They may not have known how the ancients moved mountains, but they remembered why they did, to align the world with the heavens. The Inca awakening, then, was not invention. It was realization, the rediscovery of a truth that had never truly died, that humanity was part of a grand design, written in stone and starlight. And in their brief centuries of glory, they tried to restore that design, to build once again a bridge between heaven and earth. But even the brightest sunrise casts a long shadow, and in that shadow, questions began to stir. Where did the Incas' knowledge truly come from? What hidden legacy allowed them to master agriculture at impossible altitudes, to carve roads across mountains, to design seismic-resistant architecture centuries ahead of modern science? To find the answer, we must look not at their temples, but at their minds, at the strange symbolic technology that preserved their memory across generations, without a single word written in ink. The architects of memory stone endures, but memory breathes. Empires crumble, yet thought, if woven carefully enough, can outlive even time. The Incas understood this better than any other civilization of their age, for while they left no written language, no parchment, no glyphs carved into walls, they left behind something infinitely stranger, the quipu, the knot that remembers. At first glance, a quipu seems deceptively simple, a series of colored cords, each with tiny knots, suspended from a main thread like the branches of a tree. But each knot, each twist, each hue carries meaning, mathematical, historical, spiritual. It was a data system, a library, a song. The word quipu itself comes from the Quechua quipu, meaning to tie. And in those ties, the Inca tied the soul of their world. For centuries, scholars dismiss them as primitive counting devices. But the more we study them, the more they reveal a complexity bordering on the digital. Each string could record not just quantities but categories: population, tribute, astronomy, even poetry. Some chords were spun clockwise, others counterclockwise. Binary opposites, yin and yang, encoding duality as information. It was a system of balance, reflecting the Andean view of reality itself. All creation born from the interplay of opposites. Imagine thousands of quipus hanging in the great cities of the empire, their fibers whispering data to the Quipucamayaks, the masters of memory. These were not mere scribes. They were mathematicians, historians, and priests, trained from childhood to read the knots not just with their fingers, but with their intuition. To them, numbers were sacred. They carried the pulse of the cosmos. Each quipu was a heartbeat of the sun. Some chroniclers, astonished by the precision of Inca administration, claimed that every grain of corn, every llama, every life in the empire was accounted for in quipus. Through them, the Incas managed a realm of millions without ever writing a single word. The system was so advanced that Spanish bureaucrats, unable to decipher it, destroyed most of the quipus after the conquest, fearing they contained the devil's language. What they destroyed, they could not understand. The Andean Internet, centuries before electricity. But there is a deeper layer to the mystery. In 2017, researchers from Harvard and Lima compared surviving quipus with 16th century colonial census records. To their astonishment, they found direct correspondences. The colors and knots aligned perfectly with family names, social ranks, and places. The quipus were not just ledgers. They were texts, stories written in a fiber-based code, an alphabet without letters, a syntax made of color, tension, and pattern. And perhaps beyond even that, they were portals of consciousness. The Inca viewed the quipu as more than an instrument of administration. It was a model of the universe. Each thread symbolized a life, each knot a turning point. Together, they formed the great tapestry of existence, what they called Pacha, the totality of space and time. In ceremonies, quipus were not read but sung, their vibrations carried into the air as chants, as if the chords themselves were resonant with memory. To touch a quipu was to touch the past. It's possible that this technology was not new. Similar systems have been found in much older Andean sites, long before the Inca Empire. Strands of twisted fiber used in ritual contexts, as if memory had always been woven rather than written. Could the quipu be the descendant of an even older code, inherited from the lost builders of the Andes? A living echo of the same logic that carved Tiwanaku's calendar stones and mapped the heavens over Nazca? In a sense, the Incas were not just administrators of an empire, they were architects of memory. They built their knowledge not in walls or tablets, but in the flow of time itself. To them, knowledge was not something to preserve. It was something to live inside. The quipu was not an object. It was an organism. Every knot tied the empire together, not through conquest, but through understanding. Even after the fall of Cusco, even after the temples were stripped and the priests silenced, the memory continued to breathe. In the highlands, elders still keep quippus wrapped in cloth, hidden in shrines and caves. They say the chords still speak, but only when the world is ready to listen again. To the initiated, each thread is a sunbeam frozen in fiber, each knot a heartbeat of the old gods. Perhaps one day, when the right hands find the right quipu, the Andean world will tell its story once more, not through conquest or archaeology, but through vibration, through song, through resonance. Because in truth, the Inca Empire was not an empire of land or gold. It was an empire of remembrance, the last manifestation of an intelligence that saw no difference between art, science, and spirit. But that remembrance came with a burden. The Incas knew that the cycle of the world was turning once again, that every rise carries the seed of its fall. And as they reached their zenith, they began to guard their legacy with secrecy, as if they sensed the coming storm. The empire of borrowed stones empires rise on the shoulders of memory, and the Inca, in their wisdom, built the greatest of all, not upon new foundations, but upon the bones of the ancients. Their world was a resurrection, and every stone, every terrace, every road was both a triumph and a confession, because deep down, they knew the empire they built was not entirely theirs. Walk through the streets of Cusco and you can still feel it. Beneath the colonial facades, beneath the Spanish arches, lie walls older than any empire, vast blocks of granite, curved and fitted with impossible precision. The Inca built upon them as if completing a thought left unfinished by the gods. But the lower stones, the Cyclopean giants, were older, harder, and infinitely more perfect. Even the Incas themselves admitted they did not carve them. They called them the stones of the First Age. Everywhere across their realm, the same pattern emerges. At Ollantaytambo, the massive terraces climb the mountain like steps of a sleeping titan, each block weighing as much as a locomotive. Above them, smaller, neater Inca stones continue the pattern, like the echo of a forgotten song. At Sacsayhuaman, the great fortress above Cusco, the seams between stones twist and curve like liquid. No mortar, no tool marks, only perfection, as if the mountain itself had been melted and reshaped. The Incas revered these places not as mere ruins, but as living beings, huacas, points where the divine force of the earth, Pachamama, still breathed. They built their temples atop these ancient skeletons to harness that energy, to continue the circuit between heaven and stone. They were caretakers of a power they did not create, but deeply understood. And that understanding, that humility before the old gods, was what made their empire so unique. They did not seek to erase the past. They wove it into their identity. Their architecture, administration, and cosmology all mirrored the same law, that creation is repetition. To build something new, one must remember what was forgotten. Yet as Tawantinsuyu expanded, something began to shift. The empire grew vast, consuming valleys and coastlines, uniting dozens of languages under one sun. The Sapa Inca, the unique one, sat upon a throne of gold in the Coricancha, ruling not just by might, but by myth. He was the living child of Inti, both man and god, the axis of the world. But in that divine certainty lay a quiet fragility. Because the further the Incas reached, the further they moved from the origins they sought to preserve. The old knowledge, the true meaning of the stones, began to fade, surviving only in the songs of the priests and the knots of the quippus. The builders who once could move mountains were now bureaucrats and soldiers. The sun still shone, but its light grew thin. In their final century, the Incas achieved perfection. But perfection, in the Andean world, is the moment before renewal. The cycle was turning. The priests spoke in hushed tones of omens, strange stars in the sky, the cry of the condor echoing like a warning, earthquakes shaking the sacred walls of Cusco, and somewhere in their collective memory, they remembered what always followed the height of the world, Pachacuti, the great inversion, the reset of time. The empire of the Inca was a masterpiece of inheritance, a mosaic of knowledge passed from hands long vanished. Their roads followed the same ley lines as the ancient builders. Their temples sat atop megalithic hearts that pulsed with forgotten frequencies. But in their brilliance lay tragedy. They had mastered the form, but not the origin. They had inherited the song, but not its composer. And so, when the storm finally came from the east, sails glinting like teeth on the horizon, the Incas mistook it not for invasion, but for prophecy. They believed the gods were returning, because deep in their chronicles, whispered through generations, there was a promise. The bearded teacher would one day come back across the sea, the god of the first dawn, the one who had risen from Lake Titicaca and vanished into the west. His name was Viracocha. When the Spanish appeared on the Pacific coast in the 1500s, their pale skin and shining armor seemed to fulfill that prophecy. The Incas welcomed them not as enemies, but as echoes, the embodiment of a cosmic return. They did not know that history was about to repeat itself, not as renewal, but as erasure. The empire of borrowed stones was about to become the empire of broken ones, and the silence that followed would last for centuries. The forbidden knowledge. Every empire has its dusk, but few fell with such quiet heartbreak as the Inca, not in battle alone, but in silence, in fire, in the erasure of memory itself. It was not only a kingdom that was conquered, it was a timeline. When the Spanish reached the highlands in 1532, they did not find a primitive tribe. They found an empire of engineers, astronomers, and philosophers, a civilization that spoke in gold and stone, whose laws were older than their invaders' faith. And because they could not understand it, they destroyed it. The chronicles say the conquistador Francisco Pizarro arrived with fewer than 200 men, yet within 2 years he had broken an empire that ruled millions. But the true conquest began not with swords, but with crosses, with ink, with fire. Temples were looted, idols smashed, gold melted into ingots. The Coricancha, the radiant temple of the sun in Cusco, was stripped bare. Its walls, once sheathed in sheets of gold, left naked and cold. But what the conquerors feared most was not the gold. It was the knowledge. The Amautas, the sages of the Andes, were hunted, their quipus seized and burned. The priests of the old gods were tortured until they named their gods demons. The sacred libraries of memory, the woven archives that had kept history alive for generations, vanished in smoke. A language of light, destroyed by darkness. One Spanish friar, writing decades later, confessed with sorrow, "We burned more than 20,000 quipus, believing them to be idolatrous writings. Now I fear we have burned their history." It was too late. The knots of memory were gone. But not all knowledge dies when burned. Some transforms, hiding itself in symbols, in songs, in silence. The Andean people did what they had done before. They remembered by forgetting. They hid their wisdom in plain sight, in festivals, in weaving patterns, in lullabies sung to the mountains. Every color, every rhythm, every design became a code, a secret grammar of survival. The old gods, too, retreated. Their names faded from speech but lived on in gesture and ritual. The cult of the sun merged with the saints of the church. Pachamama disguised herself as the Virgin Mary. The invaders thought they had converted the Andes, but the Andes had simply changed masks. Still, fragments of forbidden knowledge escaped the flames. Some quipus were smuggled into the mountains, hidden in caves and burial sites. Others, carried by the descendants of the Amautas, were woven into belts, ropes, and garments that passed unnoticed through generations. And in remote valleys where the Spanish rarely ventured, the old teachings endured, encoded in myth and mountain song. There were whispers of hidden manuscripts, written not on paper but carved into metal. Copper tablets buried near sacred lakes, said to preserve the law of Viracocha. The Spanish heard of them, but those who searched never returned. The locals said the mountains protected their own. Even the conquerors could not silence everything. A few friars, horrified by what they saw, began to record the stories before they vanished. Chroniclers like Garcilaso de la Vega, son of an Inca princess and a Spanish captain, wrote that his mother's people had once known the movements of the stars better than any Greek. Others hinted at secrets the priests refused to translate, knowledge too ancient, too dangerous, too beautiful. To the church, such remnants were heresy. To the Andean elders, they were salvation. In the high peaks near Vilcabamba, the last Inca stronghold, the resistance continued. There, the final Sapa Inca, Tupac Amaru, guarded what was left of the sacred lineage. When he was captured and executed in 1572, he carried with him not just royal blood, but the final breath of the empire's sacred science. They cut off his head, but not his memory. Because memory in the Andes never dies. It sleeps. For centuries after the conquest, peasants still left offerings at the foot of ancient stones. They still whispered to the mountains before planting their crops, and when asked whom they prayed to, they answered simply, to the ones who came before. The forbidden knowledge of the Andes, the real inheritance of the Incas, was not lost. It went underground, like a seed waiting for the next sunrise. But even seeds buried for ages remember the light. And as the centuries turned, as science rediscovered what had been called superstition, the world began to awaken once again to the truth the Incas had carried in silence, that history is not a ladder but a circle, that civilizations rise, fall, and rise again. The Andes had fallen into shadow, but their story was not over, because every ending in this land of cycles is only the breath before rebirth. The sky god's return night in the Andes is unlike night anywhere else on Earth. The stars do not simply appear, they descend. They burn close, heavy, alive, as if pressing against the skin of the mountains. It was under such skies that the Inca priests once lifted their faces to the heavens, whispering the same question that still haunts us today. Who were the gods that came from the stars? For centuries, their stories were treated as metaphor, poetic myths from a people seeking meaning in the cosmos. But now, as science stretches its reach into the deepest corners of the universe, those old stories begin to sound less like fantasy and more like memory. The ancient chronicles speak of Viracocha and his attendants, radiant beings who arrived after the flood, teaching humankind the arts of agriculture, architecture, and astronomy. The Aymara described them as light-bearers who walked among the mountains and vanished into the sky. Even the word Viracocha itself, from Wira, foam, and Kucha, lake, suggests something that emerged from light, from energy, from the sea of heaven. Could these legends preserve the memory of visitors not divine but celestial, travelers from elsewhere whose presence sparked the birth of civilization after the cataclysm that reset the world? In recent decades, a growing number of researchers, from archaeologists to astrophysicists, have dared to reconsider the unthinkable, that the myths of gods descending from the sky may describe real encounters, moments when ancient humanity met beings whose knowledge seemed indistinguishable from magic. Everywhere in the Andes, the evidence hums beneath the surface. At Tiwanaku, the gateway of the sun aligns not to the sky of today, but to the sky as it appeared over 12,000 years ago, a clue that someone, long before history began, charted the stars with mathematical precision. At Nazca, the geoglyphs stretch across the desert like runways, not for planes, but for something else, something the ancients may have watched descend with reverence and awe. And at Sacsayhuaman, the megalithic walls curve with such perfection that modern engineers admit they resemble heat-molded stone, as if shaped by technology, not chisel. The Spanish chroniclers, writing in the 16th century, reported that Inca priests often spoke of the shining lords who will one day return. To them, the conquistadors were the fulfillment of that prophecy, but perhaps the true meaning has yet to come. modern science adds another layer to the mystery. Astronomers studying ancient Andean alignments have discovered that many temples and mountain shrines are oriented not just to the sun or moon, but to specific constellations, particularly the Southern Cross and Alpha Centauri, the nearest star system to Earth. Why would a civilization with no telescopes focus so precisely on a cluster of stars invisible for part of the year? What did they see up there that we have forgotten down here? In the 1970s, the discovery of the Nazca astronaut figure reignited this question. A humanoid form carved into the desert cliff, its hand raised skyward, its gaze fixed eternally above. To some, it's simply art. To others, it's a message, an ancient memory of contact, frozen in sand. And perhaps like all messages, it was meant to be rediscovered only when we were ready to understand it. Because today, as we build machines to pierce the cosmos, as we launch probes beyond our solar system and listen for whispers in the void, humanity is, in a sense, repeating what the Incas once did, looking upward, hoping to reconnect. What if the great cycles of the Andes, the endless turning of Pachacuti, are not only geological, but cosmic? A rhythm not of centuries, but of epochs, each marked by the return of light from the heavens. If so, then perhaps the sky gods are not ancient astronauts in the literal sense, but manifestations of a greater pattern. The same intelligence that ignites civilizations fades into myth and returns when the world is ready. The Inca priests believed that everything in creation was alive, not only mountains and rivers, but stars. They saw the Milky Way as a great river of souls, Mayu, connecting this world to others. To die was not to end, but to cross. To live was to remember, and to remember was to awaken. Now, 5 centuries after the fall of their empire, the world once again looks to the sky, to telescopes, to signals, to questions. We are searching for what the Incas already knew, that humanity is not alone, and that knowledge, like the sun, always returns. Perhaps the gods of the sky never left. Perhaps they are the architects of the cycles themselves, the pulse behind the rise and fall of every age. And perhaps, as the old Andean prophecy said, when the world forgets the sun will return. Look up. The same stars that watched the builders of Tiwanaku still watch us now, and maybe, just maybe, they are waiting. Because the return of the gods is not a future event. It is a recognition, the moment when humanity remembers what it once was, both the child and the reflection of the cosmos. Chronicles of the survivors. Not all who live in the shadow of the Andes believe the past is gone. For some, it never left. The people who still walk these mountains, shepherds, farmers, shamans, singers, are not descendants of the Incas. They are the continuation of something older, quieter, and infinitely deeper. They are the survivors. When you climb high enough above the cloud line, where the air thins and time slows, you begin to hear it, the hum beneath the wind. It is the same frequency that vibrates through the stones of Sacsayhuaman and the strings of the quipus. To the Andean elders, that hum is memory itself, the pulse of Pachamama, the living earth. In remote villages near Cuero, Ausangate, and Apurimac, ancient traditions still survive untouched by centuries of silence. Here, the people speak Quechua not as a museum language, but as prayer. They still leave offerings of coca leaves and chicha beer to the mountains, the apus, spirits of stone who watch over the valleys. They still read the stars, not with telescopes, but with heart. Every ceremony, every harvest, every song is a conversation with the cosmos. Ask them who they are, and they will not say Inca. They will say Runa, human. To them, Runa means not just man, but the bridge between heaven and earth. It is the same word used in the oldest Quechua hymns to describe Viracocha's creation, when clay became flesh and flesh became light. The Caral people often called the last Incas, are keepers of these sacred lineages. They live high in the Peruvian Andes, at altitudes where modern life cannot easily follow. For centuries, they remained isolated, untouched by roads or conquest. Their elders say they were told to remain there, to guard the seed of the sun, until the world was ready to awaken again. Their stories are astonishingly detailed. They speak of a great flood that destroyed the first cities, of shining teachers who descended on beams of light, of temples that glowed from within. They call those beings the Apus of the sky, not gods, but ancestors who came from beyond the stars and will return when the cycle turns once more. And when you ask when that will happen, the shamans smile softly and say, it has already begun. They call this time the Taripe Pacha, the age of meeting ourselves again. To them, it is not an apocalypse, but an awakening, a moment when humanity will remember its origin, when the earth will speak, and the sun will rise within us, not above us. It is the same prophecy encoded in the old Quipus and carved into the walls of Tiwanaku. The world will renew itself when the people remember they are part of the sky. In Caral rituals, shamans still use chacana, the Andean cross, as a map of the universe. Its 3 steps represent the 3 worlds. Hanan Pacha, the world above, realm of the stars. Ke Pacha, the world of the living. Uku Pacha, the inner world, beneath the earth. To live in balance is to keep these 3 worlds in harmony. To forget is to fall into darkness. When anthropologists first recorded the Caral prophecies in the mid-20th century, they dismissed them as mythology. But the elders insisted their ancestors' wisdom was not metaphor. It was physics in poetry, an understanding of vibration, energy, and consciousness that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Even today, the Cuero perform despacho ceremonies, offerings of flowers, grains, and silver paper arranged with geometric precision. Each object symbolizes an element of the universe. When the offering is complete, it mirrors the cosmos itself, a miniature version of the world in perfect order. It is then burned or buried, returning the pattern to the earth, completing the circuit of reciprocity called Aini, sacred exchange. And perhaps that is the secret that allowed the Andes to survive every cataclysm, Aini, the understanding that everything, even memory, must flow both ways. To receive, one must give. To remember, one must forget. To live, one must die and return. The descendants of the Inca still live by that rhythm. They do not see themselves as the broken remnant of a fallen empire, but as the caretakers of something eternal. They say the sun is rising again, not in the sky, but in the hearts of those who finally listen. One elder put it simply, standing before the snow-capped peaks of Ausan Gate. The gods are not coming back. They never left. It is we who are returning to them. In that single phrase lies the entire philosophy of the Andes, and perhaps the entire mystery of human civilization. Because the real survivors are not those who endure conquest or time. They are those who keep meaning alive. And meaning still breathes here, in wind, in ritual, in blood. The Andes are not ruins. They are remembrance made mountain. But remembrance alone is not enough. If the world is awakening again, if the ancient knowledge is rising from its long sleep, what does it mean for us? The new children of the sun, the archaeology of amnesia. Every civilization buries its own truth, not always in soil, but in silence. And perhaps the greatest ruins of all are not made of stone, but of things we have chosen to forget. For centuries, the story of humanity has been told as a straight line, a steady climb from darkness to light, from primitive to civilized, from ignorance to reason. But as we've walked through the Andes, through Tiwanaku, Caral, Nazca, and the whispers of the Cuero, that line begins to curve, to fold back on itself. It becomes a circle, a cycle of remembrance and amnesia. Mainstream archaeology insists on certainty. The Incas were the first great Andean civilization. Before them, only scattered tribes and small villages. But the stones say otherwise. The myths say otherwise. And the mountains, eternal and unyielding, say otherwise. So the question becomes, Why do we refuse to listen? Perhaps because to admit the truth of the Andes, that civilizations have risen and fallen long before our accepted timeline, is to admit that we are not the first, not the pinnacle, not the authors of progress. It would mean acknowledging that history is not evolution, but memory returning. Modern science often acts like a mirror facing forward, reflecting only what it can measure. But memory is not measurable. It lingers in intuition, in myth, in the parts of ourselves we no longer trust. And yet, across the world, from Egypt to Turkey, from Japan to the Andes, we keep finding the same fingerprints. Cyclopean stones, celestial alignments, myths of gods descending, and floods that erased all before them. Is it coincidence? Or is it the same lost chapter resurfacing in fragments, the evidence of a civilization so old that it exists now only as a dream echoing through cultures that never met? In laboratories, scientists carbon date the ruins of Caral, analyze the metallurgy of Tiwanaku, decode the DNA of mummified children frozen atop Andean peaks. They find contradictions everywhere, impossible precision, inexplicable origins, technologies that appear before their supposed invention. And each time the explanation is the same: anomaly, outlier, coincidence. But how many anomalies does it take to form a pattern? The truth, perhaps, is too vast for the frameworks we've built to contain it. To accept it would mean rewriting not just history books, but our own identity. It would mean admitting that the story of civilization might not begin in Mesopotamia or Egypt, but in forgotten places, in mountain temples above the clouds, in the silence beneath the sea, in the ruins that still hum when the wind passes through them. This is the archaeology of amnesia, the excavation not of stone, but of belief. It is the process of remembering that we have forgotten, and every discovery, every ancient whisper, every pattern uncovered in the dust is a mirror asking, what else are you unwilling to remember? When the Spanish chroniclers wrote of the Inca priests' warnings that their time had ended and a darker age had begun, they did not understand that those words were not prophecy but description. The Pachacuti, the great inversion, was already happening. The world had entered another cycle of forgetting. The libraries were burned. The knowledge went underground. And history began again, as it always does, in ignorance. But the earth does not forget. The Andes, like all ancient mountains, are alive. Their stones are archives of frequency, geometry, and alignment. They remember every tremor, every hand that shaped them, every sound that moved them. They are the hard drive of a planet that has watched humanity rise and fall 100 times. And one day, when we are ready, they will speak again. In many ways, they already have. Seismic instruments pick up vibrations in the ruins that defy explanation. Electromagnetic anomalies pulse around sacred sites, reacting to solar storms as if the stones themselves are breathing. To the modern mind, this is mystery. To the ancient one, it was dialogue. We call it pseudoscience. They called it Aini, the exchange between life and matter, spirit and form. In that exchange lies the lost secret of civilization, the understanding that consciousness and creation are one. And maybe that is why we have forgotten, because in our hunger to dissect, we stopped listening. We replaced communion with control, mystery with measurement, wisdom with data. And the result is not enlightenment, it is amnesia. But amnesia, like all things in the Andes, is cyclical. And when it ends, when humanity once again opens its eyes to what it has buried, the old knowledge will not need to return. It will already be here, waiting for recognition. We are not rediscovering the past. The past is rediscovering us. And as we awaken to that truth, the silence of the Andes transforms, not into sound, but into meaning. Because the final secret of the Andes is not about gods or stones or forgotten empires. It is about us, the species that remembers through forgetting, that dies to be reborn. The cycle is turning. once again. The sun is rising on the horizon of memory. The truth buried in the Andes, dawn over the Andes. The first light spills across the peaks like molten gold, tracing every ridge, every ruin, every scar of stone. It feels less like morning and more like memory awakening, because here, at the end of all our searching, one truth stands luminous and still. The Andes were never just mountains. They are a message. For thousands of years, humanity has looked upward, asking where we come from, what gods, what stars, what forgotten hands shaped our world. But perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the mystery of the Andes is not about origin, but about continuity, the endless pulse of creation remembering itself. From the terraces of Caral to the monoliths of Tiwanaku, from the desert lines of Nazca to the temples of Cusco, one pattern repeats. The same geometry, the same reverence, the same silence. It is the voice of a civilization that understood something we have forgotten, that life, time, and consciousness are not separate things. They are one current, flowing through everything. The Inca, inheritors of this cosmic rhythm, called it Pachacuti, the turning of the world. To them, history was not progress, but pulse, a breathing of the universe. Every age was born, rose, burned, and fell, only to rise again from its own ashes. The gods were not lost, they were waiting. The knowledge was not destroyed, it was buried, within the mountains, within the human heart. Perhaps that is why we feel something when we stand before those ancient stones, that deep, wordless awe that no textbook can explain. It is the recognition of ourselves, reflected in something older than civilization. The stones remember what we are made of. Science will one day measure the truth of it, the resonance, the symmetry, the impossible precision of ancient architecture. But spirit already knows, because every ruin, every myth, every song left behind by the people of the Andes tells the same story in different language. We were here before. We will be here again. The world forgets only to remember. Perhaps the lost civilization of the Andes was never meant to be found by archaeologists, but by consciousness itself, rediscovered when humanity reached the same vibration again. And maybe that moment is now. Look around our modern world. Technology ascends like a new sun, yet our hearts grow colder. We measure everything, but understand nothing. We build higher, but dig shallower. In this imbalance, the old voices stir, not to scold, but to remind. They whisper through earthquakes, through solar storms, through the dreams of those who still listen. Remember what you are, because that is the final truth buried in the Andes, that we are not descendants of gods, nor their servants, but their continuation. The spark that fell from the stars did not vanish when the builders disappeared. It lives in our breath, in our blood, in our capacity to wonder. Every thought that reaches toward the infinite is the same act that raised Tiwanaku from stone and carved the lines of Nazca into the earth. We are the memory of that light, reborn in flesh. The Andes, those eternal witnesses, still guard the proof. Not the kind that fits neatly in museums or footnotes, but the kind that vibrates in the bones, the proof of continuity. Stand in their shadow and you feel it. The rhythm of the planet, the quiet hum of intelligence, the voice of time looping back on itself. The mountains are alive because we are, and we are alive because they remember us. In the end, the greatest revelation is simple. The Incas were not the first civilization of the Andes. They were the last guardians of a memory too vast to vanish, a memory that predates the sun and will outlive the stars. We are that memory, walking. The forgotten gods did not disappear. They became us. And every time a human looks at the horizon and feels awe instead of ownership, the ancient world breathes again. The cycle has turned once more. The sun rises, as it always has, over the silent peaks, and beneath that golden light, the truth endures, hidden in stone, in story, in the endless sky. The world does not evolve. It remembers.